So welcome to the first meeting of the Our Society's OR in the third sector special interest group for, I think it's just under 850 days, which is sort of 2.25 years. Obviously, I think you can all guess why there's been a big delay since the last meeting. So we're welcoming Matt Thomas from the British Red Cross. He's going to be talking about harnessing insight for operational improvement at the British Red Cross. Quick look at the agenda, or even not a quick look. So introduction, which is what we're going through at the moment. Then Matt Thomas will be doing his talk. Then we've allocated 15 minutes for questions. If you could put your type your questions into the chat function, then I'll read them out to Matt and we'll go through those. Hopefully we'll get exactly the right number of questions to fill up the time, and no more and no less, but that's probably unlikely. So apologies in advance if you type in a really, really good question and I miss it. And we're definite for a close at 3 o'clock. First of all, our next event, we're like London buses. It's 10th of May. Sian Besker of Data Orchard is going to talk about how organisations get better with data. Registration is not open for that, but the details will be issued closer to the date. And I could also say that we're almost got something arranged for July as well. Our objective is to have a talk every couple of months going forward, all of them on Zoom. When we get to a situation where we meet in person, I don't know, but Zoom is the way forward at the moment. First of all, we'd quite like to know about the audience that are here today. So we've got a couple of poll questions that we're about to send out. Oh, there they are. So the first one is about your sort of details of your background, and then the other is how your involvement with charities. And I'm slightly confused because as a co-host for the first time ever, I don't seem to be able to vote, but I do seem to see what everybody else is voting. Right. So I think it's about 74% of people doing OR or analytical work for charities. About 1 person is commissioning OR or one other analytical work. That's 5%. 16% or 3 people are doing both, and 5% are neither. In terms of people's involvement with charities, 79% of people are volunteers. And we've also got 37% working in humanitarian or health areas. And we've got 21% working for a charity that gets paid. Okay.
I'm online, look.
Right, so thank you for that. So I'll hand over to our speaker. You should be able to share your screen now.
Lovely, thanks very much. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you for the invite to come and talk here. I've been a big fan of the Society for a while, and we're really excited that soon we're going to be embarking on a pro bono project with one of the members, which I'll touch on just towards the end. We don't have an awful lot to say about that at the moment, but I think it's going to be quite an exciting project. But what I wanted to talk about today was some of the work that my team and other colleagues within the British Red Cross have been doing in the realm of using insights and using foresight and other anticipatory approaches for improving how we conduct our humanitarian aid, particularly within the UK. So I'm Head of Strategic Insight and Foresight for the British Red Cross. If you've read any news articles at all over the last couple of weeks, you'll have come across the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement being mentioned in a bunch of them. We are the national society that is based within the UK, and we're based across the 4 UK nations. And my team and a whole host of my colleagues, we work on the domestic side of things. So we do humanitarian aid purely within the UK, rather than the international stuff that people are much more familiar with. But given that some of our work domestically isn't so well known, I thought I'd just kick off with a bit of an overview of what we do in the UK. So we've got 3 broad areas in which we work that we refer to as strategic causes. And the vision uniting them is that we want to achieve a world in which everyone gets the help that they need in a crisis. And so these 3 areas broadly correspond to different kinds of crises. The one that we're most famous for is in the realm of disasters and emergencies. And we do a lot of work on this internationally, but within the UK, our work is predominantly focused around emergency response and also improving emergency planning. And we tend to get involved when, say, large-scale floods and storms hit, but we also do a lot of responses to domestic fires, power outages, water shortages, heat waves, and so on. Anything that puts people in a position where they are experiencing negative impacts because of some kind of hazard, whether it's weather-related or not weather-related, we will turn up and provide practical and emotional support for people, and also things like cash assistance, just to give people more choice in the aid that they're receiving. And I'll have a bit more to say on that a little bit later. And we're also doing community education, and this is mostly in the realm of humanitarian education, so doing things like resilience building. Previously, we've done work around anti-radicalisation as well, and on top of this, we also do first aid training. And then our second strategic cause is health inequalities. And typically what we do is essentially fill in some of the gaps in the health system. So where people might not be receiving care or support, and they fall through gaps between different kinds of support, we will often step in and help people who are in particularly vulnerable situations. So for example, helping people get to appointments if they have no other means of getting to an appointment, but also helping people leave hospital if they're no longer have any clinical needs to be there, but they might not have everything quite right in order to receive a care package and go home. So we can help people return to their homes and help them set up so they can live as independently as possible. And we'll do things like help them with food shopping and any kind of other practical support, and again, emotional support. But we're also doing some work around much deeper kinds of needs that people could experience. And this is our so-called high intensity use of unplanned care services. So these are people who are going to A&Es or going to GP appointments when they don't necessarily have clinical needs there, but other needs that they have are not being met by other means of support. And so this is kind of their only way of trying to signal that they need support. And we can help people who they can tend to be in very precarious situations, people who are extremely financially insecure, people with mental health issues, people with substance abuse issues, and so on. And we're also looking at expanding into doing 2 new kinds of health support services over the course of the next couple of years. One is going to be in digital inclusion, and this is something that we very much saw being a key barrier to accessing support during the pandemic, certainly during national lockdowns when everybody was stuck at home, but not everybody has got access to devices or access to data plans or the skill or even the will to use digital systems. And so we're seeing what we can reasonably do within the realm of digital inclusion in the health space to help people access the support that they need. And the final new service that we're spinning up at the moment is what we're calling Waiting Well. So this is helping people who are stuck on the ever-growing backlog of waiting for elective care, and especially people who've been waiting, say, a year or longer than a year. We're trying to understand what it is that we can offer as a humanitarian organisation to help people wait as well as they possibly can until they can get the support that they need, clinically speaking. And the third area that we work in is displacement and migration. So we are the UK's largest refugee charity. We work with refugees, people seeking asylum, people who've been trafficked and otherwise exploited, and also migrants who are in vulnerable situations for different reasons, such as undocumented migrants. And the aim here, and this is one of the areas that we work in that really does combine the international work and the domestic work very closely, because of wanting to have people have safe migration routes, have dignity and choice all along their journey. So we, along with all other Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies across the world, help people find missing loved ones. We do international family tracing, and we do family reunion work. We help people leave unsafe situations, and this can include things like gender-based violence, domestic abuse as well. We help people access support. We help people get integrated into communities when they move into the UK. We provide cash assistance, psychosocial support, and also other forms of casework, just to really help address the multi-dimensional needs that people in these situations might have, particularly given, say, a lot of underlying traumas and so on. So really quite profound work, and also very very apt for some of the stuff that's been in the news recently that I'll touch on a little bit later. But who am I and who are we? My team exists, the Strategic Insight and Foresight team exists in order to essentially be a bit of a decision support unit for our work in the UK. We've got a strategic ambition to be much more evidence-based, much more led by insight. And what we want to do is get to a position where we're targeting and allocating our resources, including our people, our staff, our volunteers, but also our money when we're doing cash assistance, our stuff when it comes to, say, giving out water, sandbanks and so on. We want to be much smarter about how we allocate and target these resources. And we also want to be really clear on the groups of people for whom we can have the most meaningful impact. And so my team exists in order to help us answer some of these questions. And we're a team of qualitative and quantitative researchers and analysts. And we use this mixed methods approach to try and really produce insights that are actionable for the key strategic decision makers and operational decision makers in the organization. And we do a lot of external analyses. So mostly what our work revolves around is these kind of contextual and systemic analyses, environment scans, horizon scanning, particularly because we want to keep an eye on the road ahead as well, or as the case may be, the roads ahead, because there is no one certain future. We try to monitor emerging needs, emerging vulnerabilities and risks and capacities to respond as far as we can, and do things like scenario planning, pestle analyses, SWOT analyses, to really help try and anticipate as much as we can around different kinds of future crises, so that we'll be in a good position to deal with them and not have that negatively affect us as an organisation, which can then have poor knock-on effects for other people. And at the bottom of this slide is just a bit of a smattering of some of the things that we do as a team. And I think in the context of this talk, I'm probably going to touch on almost all of it. So I'll just jump into the case studies. And I'm going to talk about 3 case studies, one for each of the 3 strategic causes. And I'm going to present them in chronological order because that's just how it came into my mind. So we're kicking off with the pandemic, which I imagine is still fresh in everybody's minds, given it's not yet over. So what we started doing, it was essentially, I think this was the day after the national lockdown was announced, we started figuring out how we could reasonably map vulnerability to COVID-19 within the UK at a neighbourhood level. So for those who are into GIS kind of work, we were working at middle layer super output area level. These are quite small neighbourhoods of around 7,000 people within England and Wales, and slightly smaller areas within Northern Ireland and Scotland. And we wanted to develop a multi-dimensional index for this because vulnerability to COVID-19 is and was a multi-dimensional phenomenon. So we were looking at clinical vulnerability, which is broadly people who were shielding, but also we wanted to look at some of the socioeconomic factors affecting people being in vulnerable situations. So things like if you work in one of the sectors that got shut down during the lockdowns, or if you're in a financially precarious situation, or if you live in areas where there is, for example, poor air quality, which is another known risk factor for poor outcomes from COVID. And we were also looking at wider health and well-being as well. I'm not going to go into the details of how we built this map, but I'd be very happy to answer any techie nerdy questions on it in the Q&A a little bit later. And as well as using this map internally, we also did a lot of publicity work around it as well, reaching out to other organisations who we thought would benefit from it. And it was used, for example, by the Scottish Public Health Observatory, by a handful of local authorities, and also community foundations. Community foundations are grant-giving organisations that work regionally across the UK. And excitingly, it was also used by Arts Council England, which I only found out recently that they used it to determine funding awards for some priority places in the southwest of England. And it was also cited by the OR Society in your COVID-19 resource hub, which was really cool. So rather than talk about the techie side of the map, I want to talk about how we used it for service design and service delivery. One example is we set up a hardship fund. We got a very generous donation of £5 million from Aviva, who wanted us to essentially be the grant givers to people who are in vulnerable situations. And we're very pro doing cash assistance within the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, because it's a way of giving people humanitarian aid that gives them the dignity to choose what they want to spend that money on. So rather than turning up to somebody, for example, with a food parcel saying, here you go, that's it, or here's, I don't know, some blankets that you might not need, it gives you the means to go and get the kind of aid that is most relevant to you at the moment. Or if you want to plan longer term, you can bank the money and use it for longer term purposes. And so we wanted to design this for certain at-risk groups, particularly those who were in very vulnerable situations, probably, and more often than not, on the verge of destitution or living in destitution. So people who are experiencing extreme poverty. And this includes people with no recourse to public funds, so people that can't access universal credit or housing allowance and so on. But also people who were trying to access support and perhaps access statutory support for the first time, but were experiencing delays or disruptions in that. So this could be essentially a replacement for the universal credit bridging loan. And households where they'd lost their primary earner, or people who had survived gender-based violence, people who were facing homelessness or living in emergency accommodation. So people who were like really on the margins of being able to access support anywhere else. And this was a really nice use of insights, because it wasn't just taking locations on a map and saying, okay, let's go here. It was combining this with what our local teams knew, so like local intelligence, local expertise, to really enable this form of support to be as targeted for local needs as it could be. So for example, in the Midlands, we ended up focusing on refugees who were at risk of destitution, whereas in East Anglia, it was much more about communities on the coast where they were losing income due to things like there being no tourist industry during this time. And so we were really able to do some very nuanced kinds of support, and also signpost people into things like casework and other kinds of support if they needed it. And we ended up giving the 5 million out to around 13,000 people, and we did a bit of an analysis of the potential reach of this service, and found that we reached around 1 in 8, 1 in 9 people who were eligible for support countrywide, which I think, like, given such a short amount of time in which we had to set this up, is a pretty remarkable feat. Another interesting thing that we did was leaflet drops for people who are digitally excluded in Essex. This is a cool one because it was postcode level data. So we could use some postcode level data that we had on age and also digital exclusion and different forms of digital exclusion to really target at near enough to a household level people who might require support. And then this informed a leafleting campaign that we did, signposting people to our support line. And I think we sent out around 40,000 leaflets in the end, which is a pretty good like mass mailing kind of campaign. And another exciting thing that we did was helping support flu vaccines in Trafford. So this is something that we do yearly, helping vulnerable people get to their flu jab appointment. But we realized as we were making this that we could also use it to identify potential sites for mobile COVID-19 test sites. So we did a bit of a geographical analysis looking at neighborhoods that were highly vulnerable to COVID, particularly socioeconomically vulnerable, and also neighboring areas, and look at where they had hospitals with car parks or just other car parks in the areas. And this was this was something that local government was looking at the time for setting up mobile testing. So we built this as a public-facing dashboard. I don't think it's accessible any longer, but for a time it was a publicly accessible dashboard that we sent out to a few local authorities to help them then do this determination about where they could or should be doing mobile COVID-19 testing, particularly in order to reach people who otherwise they might not reach. The final thing that I want to talk about, actually no, the penultimate thing I want to talk about in the pandemic is mapping potential vaccine hesitancy. And this was a bit of work that we did with a very rapid collaboration with University College London, the team who's doing the COVID-19 social study there. We were doing a bit of a review of meta-analyses and other high quality research, looking at what are the key drivers of vaccine hesitancy that we're seeing across studies. And through looking at them, and we found, generally speaking, it's gender, ethnicity, low income, education, and flu vaccination were some of the key drivers. And this was particularly for COVID-19 hesitancy. So working with one of the researchers at University College London, we developed a model based on some of their existing work that we could then use to map at local authority level where people might be more hesitant to have the COVID-19 vaccine. And this then went on to inform a vaccine hesitancy project that we rolled out into two kind of tranches. One was a nationwide social media campaign. We got a bunch of celebrities and community leaders and so on to do some social media around this, but also we were doing some very targeted in-person community outreach work in some of the most unwilling, most hesitant areas, particularly where they had higher proportions of people who were seeking asylum or people who were refugees, because often, particularly for people with asylum, it's hard to access the health service. So we just wanted to give that extra helping hand. And the last thing I'll talk about in the pandemic is something that we did just before Christmas. And looking at the news today, it might be that we have to do it again with the so-called Deltachrome variant. This is an example of some of the more horizon scanning anticipatory work we do that's in the qualitative realm. So when Omicron was being first identified as a variant of concern and it was beginning to spread across nations, we conducted a very rapid assessment looking at the situation as it was known, particularly in South Africa, and anything that we could have learned from what's going on in South Africa, but also some of the wider context in the UK as well, looking at things like NHS pressures and so on. So really give us a bit of a guide to what we could be doing as a UK-based charity in order to prepare ourselves for any extra support that might be needed. And we did some light touch scenario planning as part of this. And we shared this with our friends at the Voluntary and Community Sector Emergencies Partnership, the VCSEP. The British Red Cross is one of the, what are we, co-hosts? Co-chairs. We're one of the co-chairs of this partnership, which is about 200 plus voluntary organisations within England. So we were sharing that with them, and then we could have these conversations with other voluntary partners, particularly smaller, much more community-based organisations, about the kinds of support that we may or may not need to give in the pandemic in this case. But we're also doing these kinds of assessments for other pieces of work as well. And now on to disasters and emergencies. I just want to focus briefly on storms and floods. There's been an awful lot of them recently, and I think we've done some really interesting work in order to help us become a bit more anticipatory and a bit more prepared around it. So this piece of work began late last year. It was just before Storm Arwen hit, and we were trying to think, what could we do, given that we've got all of these disaster maps, these resilience maps we've been working on. What could we do to provide something bespoke to local teams to give them a better understanding, if they don't already have one, of vulnerabilities within their communities? And so what we did was take the severe weather warnings from the Met Office, and where you have particularly the red areas and the amber areas, we looked at neighbourhoods within them that we had data for, which is at a neighbourhood level for most of the UK, looking at some of the key drivers of vulnerability to storms and the flood. So for this initial version, we were looking at things like older people, people living alone, people receiving universal credit, people experiencing fuel poverty, and so on. And this was just this was such a rapid thing. Like, we did it in one day just before Storm Arwen hit. And now we're thinking about how can we make this a much more nuanced analysis. So for example, you'd want to understand where people are age 70 plus and living alone and financially insecure. So we're trying to work out what are some of the next steps we can take to do that more detailed kind of analysis. And also looking at possibilities for automating this as well. So when a severe weather warning occurs, can we just automatically send out these vulnerability profiles to local teams? So watch this space for that. And the other thing that we've been working on, and this is pretty hot off the press, we were just doing this late last week, is doing a bit of an analysis of vulnerability to flooding. And this is vulnerability to flooding now, but also looking at climate projections to 2050 and to 2080, and seeing what parts of the country could become more vulnerable and what are those key drivers of increasing vulnerability. So for this work, we took a model that was developed by Paul Sayers and colleagues at a consultancy on behalf of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And they published this back in 2015, and it was using data from the census in 2011. And what we wanted to do was partly update this with some of the more up-to-date information. So for example, age, structure and health within local communities is going to be quite different compared to 10, 11 years ago, particularly after having been through a pandemic. But there was also other factors within this model that we were keen to explore in more detail and update as well. So it's things like looking at people's social networks within local communities, looking at community supports, and also where particular kinds of support could be also at risk of flooding. So if your GP surgery is in a flood risk area, or if your fire and rescue service or your local hospital are in flood risk areas, that could have a corresponding negative impact on the amount of support that you yourself can receive should a flood occur. And also included income and other measures of financial vulnerability as well. So we were keen to update as much as we could, and took the opportunity to look at how vulnerability had changed between 2011 and 2022. And so this map shows for MSOAs, for small neighbourhoods within England, where vulnerability has either increased, which are the darkening shades of red, or has decreased, which are the blue areas. And we found that the northeast and the northwest had the highest proportions of neighbourhoods becoming more vulnerable, and London had the highest proportion of neighbourhoods becoming less vulnerable. And some of the key drivers behind these changes in vulnerability were population aging and also changes to population health. And that works both ways. If your area becomes more vulnerable, it's because of age and health. And if it becomes less vulnerable, it's because of age and health, which in that case was a bit of a surprise, because we anticipated that changes to community support could be one of the key drivers of becoming less vulnerable to flooding. But it seems like there's a really strong demographic tilt to this. So we've got a bit more to explore on this. Also, we're very avidly awaiting the release of the new census data as well, so we can do a complete revamp of this. But in the shorter term, we're using this work to inform a large-scale policy research project that some of my colleagues are leading on. And the next step of this is to use these maps in order to inform how we're going to be recruiting people from at-risk areas because we really want to get people with lived experience of flooding to feed into the research. But also what we want to do is choose areas where they're currently not vulnerable to flooding, not at risk of flooding, but the models are predicting that by 2050 or 2080, they could become a risk of flooding. And also the structure of the population is such that people are likely to be more vulnerable to flooding in those areas. And so we want to go to some of these places and ask people about what they're doing in order to prepare for future flood risks, if anything. So it's a really nice initial use of this mapping work. And the final case study I want to talk about is Ukraine. So this is a fast changing situation, as you'll all be aware. What we've been doing so far in the realm of this is a rapid early action assessment. And I should say everything that I'm talking about for Ukraine here is about potential humanitarian impacts and humanitarian consequences within the UK. We've got colleagues in our international departments who are looking at the situation within Ukraine itself and also within the surrounding region, but my team's focusing just on the domestic side of things. So we conducted a rapid early action assessment, a bit like the one we did for Omicron, but rather than doing a wider situational analysis, we decided to jump straight into the scenarios and ended up with, I think it was five kinds of scenarios, ranging from things that are fairly certain, like compounding the cost of living crisis, potentially increases of food insecurity, things like that, all the way down to anticipating potential nuclear scenarios. So this could be anything from a nuclear attack to radiation borne on winds coming over to the UK, a bit like from Chernobyl in 1986. So we're trying to figure out what can we learn from the past that will help us anticipate anything that we might need to do as much as possible. And then, because we are the UK's largest refugee charity, we also did some specific scenarios for people seeking protection in the UK. So this is partly looking at some of the known government forms of support out there, such as the one announced yesterday, the Homes for Ukraine scheme, also the Ukraine Family Scheme. But we're also trying to work out, because people have multiple means and multiple routes of coming to the UK with varying degrees of safety, varying degrees of needs associated with them, we wanted to figure out, as far as we can, what potential routes might people take, what kinds of needs might people present with when they arrive in the UK, and how might this change over time as well. So, for example, the initial group of people who have fled Ukraine, it doesn't include men of working age. They may come in future waves of people, or people leaving early. They could be better off, they've got the means to flee the country, whereas people who haven't been able to do that might not be in that same position. They might not have family over here, so might not have existing support network, and so on. So we were looking at a variety of scenarios for people coming into the country, but also looking at people from Ukraine who are already in the UK, either on a variety of different visas or already settled in the UK, but also the small number of people who had sought asylum previously from Ukraine as well. So a very big complex analysis that has ended up being quite a massive Word document. And we're monitoring the situation all the time. Like, I often describe our jobs as professionally doom scrolling, and we're just doing that constantly and we're going to be looking at our scenarios again this afternoon after we finish here, to share them with the Emergencies Partnership on Thursday, and then get a wider conversation going about the potential kinds of support and needs that may be necessary. And it would be remiss of me not to highlight our humanitarian appeal for Ukraine. If you're willing and if you're able, please go to donate.redcross.org.uk and give whatever you can. Ukraine is not the only crisis, not the only conflict. There's also high levels of humanitarian needs in Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, Eritrea, Democratic Republic of Congo. And each have got horrific refugee crises associated with them. So yeah, any support that anyone can give is gratefully received. And now to end, hopefully on a slightly more optimistic and upbeat note, I just want to spend a bit of time talking about some of the things that we're going to be working on next. So the maps that I've shown throughout this talk, these are what we're calling our resilience index. We're building two versions of them. One is essentially a disaster risk map to help with disaster risk reduction, and the other is around health inequalities. And we're looking at building out these even more. We've got kind of prototype versions of them ready at the moment that people are using internally, but what we want to get to is a point with the disasters resilience index of being able to have quite nuanced vulnerability and capacity models for different kinds of hazards. So, for example, the flood one that I showed earlier, but we're also going to be building a heat waves version. We might do a separate storms one if it turns out the vulnerabilities to storms aren't enough the same as for flooding. And in the health space, we've been using the ONS's Health Index for England, which is a brilliant composite index that looks at poor health outcomes, risk factors for health conditions, but also the wider determinants of health. So we've been developing versions of this for the devolved nations, which are all publicly accessible if they're helpful to anyone on this call, and also developing a model of health system capacity as well, so we can look for where the NHS and other health providers could be particularly squeezed at any given time, just to help us be that much more targeted in our kinds of support. And then in the realm of scenario planning, horizon scanning, we're continuing with our Ukraine work, but also we're going to be doing some broader scenario planning for our strategy. So the three strategic causes I mentioned at the beginning, these are the core part of our strategy that will take us through to 2030. And we're doing our strategic planning in 3-year cycles. And so in this summer, we're going to be doing some scenario planning workshops with some stakeholders internally. And we're figuring out various kinds of pre-work we could do in the realm of, say, PESTLs and SWOTs, and identifying drivers of change for them. We're building an emergency planning tool. This one's in purple because it's work with the DCSEP, and their logo with purple. So this is going to be a publicly accessible tool that the Resilience Index will be built into, that will enable particularly much smaller, more community-based organizations to be able to get a greater understanding of potential vulnerabilities, capacity to support, risk of hazards, and also key demographics within their local areas. So we're using that as part of a way to help the sector become better at emergency planning. So this is going to link to some exciting new work that's around sharing knowledge, sharing frameworks and templates for doing emergency planning, and just really trying to make it as easy as possible for organizations who've not done emergency planning before to get into it. On the research side of things, my team is doing some analyses of cohorts for the 3 strategic causes. So, for example, in health, we're looking at people who maybe struggle the most to access care for whatever reason, or people who might be digitally excluded from healthcare. And we're looking at, of these cohorts, which groups of people might we, as the British Red Cross, be able to have the most meaningful impact for. So this is another element of our targeting our work in a much smarter way. We're also going to be embedding our insight products into our organizational decision support tools. So we've got a bunch of Power BI dashboards that are used by teams internally, and we want to get our more externally facing insight products, especially the resilience index, embedded within these, so they can really be a part of everyday decision making for our local teams. Last but not least, we're going to be looking at capacity planning within our emergency response services, and this is the pro bono OR project that I mentioned. So hopefully I'll come back at some point in the future and there'll be some good news from that. And it just remains for me to say thank you, especially to my brilliant team, Elle, who is on maternity leave at the moment, Claire, who's her maternity cover, Freya, Mike, Aileen, and Jen. And also, this wouldn't have been possible without help from some very kindly external nerdy people who just gave loads of time and goodwill, particularly during the pandemic when everything was very panicky, to help us out. And these are my contact details. Do say hello. I'll leave this up on screen and hand over to Malcolm. And thank you for listening.
Right, thank you. Thank you. That's unmute there for a moment. So I think there are no questions in the chat function. Does anyone have a question? You raise your hand using the function. Noise. Actually, there was a suggestion that we all switch our cameras on, which I'm not sure if that's possible.
Yeah, it would be great to see some faces. If there's Jane. Hi, Jane. Hi, Karen.
Everybody's camera's working except mine. Okay, so any questions?
Jane's waving her hand.
It's just sort of thinking forward to the census and whenever that gets released. Given it was undertaken at a slightly strange time, are you going to have to do a lot of contingency testing with that data to see how far it's changing your existing models and whether those changes are reasonable?
Yeah, very interesting question. We haven't thought that far ahead yet. That's a really good point. I think I was maybe naively hoping that the ONS would do that on our behalf and take that into account in anything that they publish. I suppose we could fairly simply, since we're aggregating things up to a neighbourhood level, we could just look at changes between areas and see if there's anything particularly untoward happening. But I'm hoping it's going to be a reasonably accurate state of the UK, even like certainly in terms of some of the demographic side of things, because ONS last week, I think it was, they did a pre-release of some of local authority level data on where people from Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, Poland, Romania, some of the surrounding areas to the conflict are living at the moment, which has been super helpful for us because we're trying to map and reach out to Ukrainian community groups in order to just offer whatever support we can offer to them. Say like, we're here, what do you need? So I'm hoping that that kind of stuff is, at least reasonably accurate.
Yeah, we have a question about how do you model and optimize the logistics aspects of your operations?
The short answer is we don't really at the moment, not in any really, not in a way we're particularly happy with. I'll caveat that by saying internationally we do an absolutely brilliant job of logistics. We're known as international experts in humanitarian logistics. I'm speaking purely about the domestic side of things. We've done some logistics modeling work in the past, particularly around warehousing. So one of the services that we offer is a mobility aid service. We do wheelchair loans, and we store them in a couple of warehouses across the UK. And we did a bit of logistics modeling around that a couple of years ago to help us understand where our warehouses would be best placed. We did some of it during the pandemic. We got some external experts to help us out with some food aid related logistics. So we were partnering with FairShare, and they were very good on the logistics side of things. And some of our corporate partners are logistics companies as well. So we were doing that, particularly for our food aid services. But again, it was kind of a one-off. But this is something that we're keen to explore as part of the Pro Bono project, thinking not only in terms of our own capacity planning, but because our capacity is partly about where our vehicles are, where the stuff is that we need to deliver during an emergency response. So I imagine that logistics is going to come into that and just help us get that bit smarter about it.
Okay, thank you. If you want to ask a question. Both?
Sorry, did you say?
Do
Is that
you want to
me?
ask a question? Yes, you.
Yeah, I've got. I thought that was a fantastic talk, Matt. Thanks very much. And it was so rich. It's hard to know where to start with all of the. Oh, tell us a bit more about. Tell us a bit more about. And I was interested in your giving money to people through the Hardship Fund rather than services or things they might not need, which is quite a contrast with the government approach during the pandemic. So there may even be some people on this call who are old enough to have received parcels of food that they didn't want or need on their doorsteps. Do you want to just say a bit about the challenges of the money approach compared with the goods approach, especially in the pandemic when cash handling was problematic and not everybody had electronic banking?
Yeah, so it wasn't cash that we gave out, it was cash cards. So the money handling side was fine, but it did lead to I suppose in a slightly unexpected slowdown, because a lot of manual processing was needed in order to get the cards into envelopes, get them registered with the provider company, the banks and everybody. So there was a bit of a logistical slowdown from that we've been learning from since, although we haven't had to do cash assistance at that kind of scale so far since the pandemic. It's definitely been some learnings in the actual processes on the supply side of it that's been interesting, but also because cash, although it does give that extra freedom, that extra dignity to the aid you're receiving, it's not the kind of support you'd want to give in 100% of cases, because you might have people, you give them a cash card but they can't get out to the shops in order to get the goods that they need, or the goods aren't in their local shops, or they can't do shopping online and so on. So there's definitely a place for giving people stuff. It's just much more about making sure that the stuff that you give people, they've asked for it, they want it. So yeah, I think there's been some good learnings from that. But because on the international side of things, it's something that we've been really good at for a long time now, we were learning from a lot of our international colleagues how to do that well within the UK. And I've just seen in the chat there's a question about sharing knowledge with other Red Crosses.
I thought that's perfect. He's leading into the next question perfectly. So
yeah, very smoothly done. So yeah, that's exactly how we're sharing learning, because on the international side of things, they're very good at logistics, cash assistance, and also water and sanitation and hygiene, which typically we don't need to do too much within the UK, you know, at least now, unless we're talking about doomsday scenarios. But there's some nice ways of learning well from each other in those respects, like all the deep kinds of subject matter knowledge that we have. In respect for the kind of insight products and insight-based work that I've been talking about, there's a few things that we've done and are going to be doing. So when we were doing our initial COVID vulnerability work, we were sharing that with the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So this is one of our kind of convening bodies. We were sharing it with them. They've done other kinds of nation level vulnerability mapping in the past, and we're just interested to learn about our techniques. And also spoke to some of our sister national societies, particularly in America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And this led to the 5 of our national societies now having regular monthly calls to talk about anticipatory stuff and learn from the different approaches we're taking to things like anticipating crises that are, say, one season ahead or a few years ahead, but also learning from each other in terms of things like organizational design, improving decision making and everything. So it's been like a really rich but informal collaboration. And then more on the anticipatory side of things, one of my colleagues is setting up a bit of a foresight group across the movement. So there's an organization called the Solferino Academy, which is named after the battlefield where the person who set the Red Cross, Henri Dunant, originally had the idea for setting up the Red Cross. They've got an academy which is a bit like a think tank, and they're setting up a foresight network across national societies. So very excited to see how we can all share the kind of scenarios kind of work that we're doing together.
Okay, we have another question about scenario planning inside of what to include, exclude, for example, Ukraine migration, Russian migration.
Is very much an art, not a science, this one. We tend to do it, ideally we do it in as open and participative and iterative a way as possible. So I'm a fan of, when you begin doing this kind of scenario planning work, you just get as much out of everyone's brains as you can, and then you do the refining and the filtering afterwards. So, for example, for some of the stuff we're going to be doing this afternoon, we would be looking at Ukraine migration, Russian migration under different kinds of scenarios as well. And we might be saying, okay, this kind of thing, it's going to be, it could be, you know, what they call a predetermined element, something that is already in the pipeline, you know it's happened and it's going to have some known knock-on effect. But I think the thing that's trickier to decide on what to include or exclude is the so-called critical uncertainties, the sort of known unknowns around it. And it's kind of tricky to know what to include or exclude, particularly because we want to move from a position which we're in at the moment, which is having fairly exploratory scenarios, into having scenarios that are much more geared towards decision making. And for that, you need to cut through as much of the complexity as you can and make them much more about getting into the minds of the decision makers here. And I think the way we're going to do that is, again, through this open and iterative process. So we don't really have principles at the moment for what we'd include or exclude, but just through the conversations, it will hopefully become clear what's known in terms of high or low impacts and high or low uncertainties that should give us that guidance for what to include or exclude.
Okay, I've got a question actually. Mine's international and gloomy, because it seems to me that there's going to be a worldwide food shortage in about a year to 18 months. I heard last week that between them, Russia and Ukraine produce about 10% of the calories that are, I think it's traded calories actually, which I'm not entirely sure what that precisely means. But if those supplies of food disappear, then it may be that for the first time in a long time, the world can't actually feed itself. So this is an international Red Cross question. Is there anybody looking at that?
Yeah, our colleagues in the International Directorate are looking at that kind of thing at the moment. So yeah, for the first time ever, we've been collaborating on scenario plans or scenario analyses to feed up to our executive leaders. And yeah, these longer term consequences like food insecurity, potential civic unrest that could stem from the food insecurity as well. So in some of the areas that are liable to experience food insecurity in the future from this. In the past, they've had things like riots, governments being overthrown, inspired by food shortages. And then that's going to have a knock-on effect of potential future refugee crises, large-scale migrations from these areas. So on the UK side of it, we're going to be trying to look at some of these more ripple effects for where people might be coming to the UK. But yeah, on the international side, our colleagues are looking at those sort of more immediate, well, no, not immediate, the known first order and second order effects.
Yeah. Okay. Horizon scanning is a future operational development process for logistical supply to Ukraine for 23 to 25. That's in the chat.
An interesting question. I don't know the answer, actually. I can check with our international colleagues and let you know.
Okay. I imagine it all depends on what happens.
Yeah, I'd imagine so.
Yeah. Okay, any more questions? You may have to wave rather than put in the chat. I think we're doing quite well on time, actually. We've got 3 minutes or 2.5 minutes to go. So again, thank you, Matt, for your talk. It's been very interesting.
I was going to ask a question.
Oh, sorry.
If I may, can I just sneak one in the last 2 minutes? Matt, is impact measurement. So especially, for example, you talked about actionable insights, and presumably then you want to measure the impact of those. Do you do much impact measurement or outcomes measurement?
Not as much as we should, but it's very high on our list, or it was high on our list until Ukraine happened. But yeah, Claire, who's our strategic insight lead, that's one of the projects she's looking at the moment. We did some more informal impact measurement for our vulnerability index for COVID, but we're trying to work out how could we do better impact measurement for our insight products now. And then on a broader organizational scale, some of my colleagues in our evaluation team are looking at how we do proper outcome measurement and impact measurement under our 3 strategic causes.
Thank you. Thanks, Malcolm.
Any more questions in the last few seconds? Okay, so again, thank you, Matt. It's excellent talk. We all appreciate you've been very busy. So thank you.
No, thank you. It's nice to take my mind off it for a bit.
Thank you. Thank you. And see other people on the 10th of May.
Indeed.
At our next meeting.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.